Ambassador Marcus Chen had been smiling politely through 6 hours of the Galactic Council's deliberate insults about humanity's primitive emotional responses and unsuitable diplomatic temperament, maintaining the carefully controlled facade that Earth's diplomatic corps had drilled into him for 2 years of preparation. But when Council High Arbiter Velshar, a towering crystalline being whose species had held galactic power for 3 millennia, casually mentioned that humanity's admission to the Council was contingent on providing 12 million human subjects for cognitive baseline testing that would involve invasive neural mapping, likely to cause permanent psychological damage, Marcus felt something inside him snap with an almost audible click, and the smile that had been plastered on his face for the entire session finally, irreversibly died. The council chamber fell silent because every species present, from the methane-breathing Korth delegates to the hive-minded Zesic collective, had evolved sophisticated enough social perception to recognize the change in Marcus's body language, the way his spine straightened from diplomatic slouch to military attention, the way his hands unclenched from the submissive position Earth's protocol officers had taught him to the relaxed readiness of someone who'd spent a decade in Earth's Marine Corps before switching to diplomatic service, the way his eyes, which had been carefully downcast in the approved humble petitioner expression, now locked onto Vilshara with an intensity that made several nearby delegates unconsciously shift away. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that the translation matrices struggled to render properly across different species communication methods. "Could you repeat that last part? About 12 million human subjects. Because I want to make absolutely certain I understood you correctly before I respond." Velshar's crystalline form refracted. The council chambers lightened, patterns that indicated amusement among her species, clearly interpreting Marcus's request as the continued deference they'd been receiving from humanity's diplomatic corps for months. "The requirement is quite standard for primitive species seeking council membership," Velshar said, her voice resonating through the translation system with harmonics designed to emphasize her species' superiority. "Your species must prove cognitive compatibility with civilized galactic standards. This requires comprehensive neural baseline documentation across significant population samples. 12 million subjects represents merely 0.15% of your total population, a negligible sacrifice for the privilege of council consideration. Surely you understand that advanced civilizations cannot risk association with species whose neural architecture might harbor unpredictable behavioral patterns." Marcus nodded slowly, and anyone who'd served with him in the Marines would have recognized that particular nod, the one that meant he'd just made a decision that was going to make someone's day significantly worse. But the council delegates, insulated by millennia of unquestioned authority and supremacy, missed the warning signs entirely. "I see," Marcus said, still in that dangerously quiet tone, "and these 12 million humans, they'd be selected how exactly?" Velshar's form shifted in what her species used as a dismissive gesture. "Random selection from your lower functioning populations would be sufficient. Your elderly, your cognitively impaired, your criminal elements. Populations that contribute minimally to your species' development and whose sacrifice would provide optimal cost-benefit ratios for both parties." "We are not unreasonable, Ambassador Chen. We understand resource allocation concerns." The translation system faithfully rendered her words across the council chamber, and Marcus saw several other species delegates nodding in agreement, clearly considering this a generous offer by galactic standards, and he realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that Earth's entire diplomatic approach had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. That trying to play by the council's rules, accepting their framework, adhering to their protocols, had only convinced them that humanity was as weak and desperate as every other species that came begging for council membership. "Okay," Marcus said, and his tone shifted from quiet to conversational, almost friendly, which somehow felt more threatening than if he'd started shouting. "I'm going to say some things now, and I need you all to understand that I'm no longer speaking as Earth's ambassador. Following the very careful diplomatic protocols my government spent 2 years teaching me, I'm speaking as a human being who just watched you casually propose what amounts to medical experimentation on 12 million people, including, and let me make sure I'm clear on this, specifically targeting my species' most vulnerable populations are elderly, are disabled, are incarcerated because you've decided they're expendable. He stood up from his seat. Another violation of council protocol, where junior petitioners remained seated unless granted explicit permission to stand. And several delegates made sounds of protest, but Marcus ignored them completely. Here's what's going to happen now. I'm going to explain exactly why humanity will never, under any circumstances, accept council membership under these or any similar terms. And then I'm going to explain why you just made the worst miscalculation in this council's 3,000-year history. And I need you all to pay very close attention, because I'm only going to say this once. Velshera's crystalline form flickered in patterns indicating irritation. Ambassador Chen, you forget yourself. You are a petitioner before this council. You have no authority to dictate terms or make threats. Sit down before we revoke Earth's petition entirely. Marcus's laugh was sharp and entirely without humor. Revoke it, please. Go ahead. Save me the trouble of formally withdrawing it myself. Because here's what you don't understand about humanity. What? Your intelligence reports and cultural assessments and 3 years of watching our diplomatic corps bend over backward to accommodate your protocols completely missed. We've been polite because we thought maybe, just maybe, you were worth being polite to. We've been accommodating because we believe there might be mutual benefit in galactic cooperation. We've been humble because we recognized we were the newcomers to a civilization thousands of years older than ours. But you just confused politeness for weakness. And that is a mistake humans have been teaching each other not to make for our entire evolutionary history. He started walking, another protocol violation, moving from the petitioner's designated area toward the center of the council chamber, where only recognized members were permitted. And security drones began activating, their weapons systems humming to life. But Marcus didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just kept talking as he walked. Let me tell you what humanity is, since your assessments clearly got it wrong. We're a species that evolved on a death world that tried to kill us in approximately 10,000 different ways. We survived ice ages and supervolcano eruptions and asteroid impacts that would have ended most species. We domesticated animals that outweighed us by tons and turned them into working partners. We looked at birds and decided we wanted to fly too, so we invented aviation. We looked at space and decided we wanted to go there, so we strapped ourselves to controlled explosions and went. We've fought wars that killed millions of our own people and then rebuilt and tried to do better. We've created art and music and literature that moves us to tears. We've built civilizations and destroyed them and built new ones from the ashes. And through all of that, the one consistent feature of humanity is that we protect our vulnerable. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but we try. It's built into our social structures and our moral frameworks and our deepest cultural values across every nation and ethnicity and belief system. So when you casually suggest using our elderly and disabled as experimental subjects because they're expendable, you're not just insulting us. You're fundamentally misunderstanding what makes us human. The security drones were surrounding him now, weapons trained on his position. But Marcus noticed they hadn't fired, hadn't even issued warnings. And he realized that someone on the council, maybe several someones, wanted to hear what he was going to say. Wanted to know what happened when humanity's polite mask came off. You want to know about human neural architecture? Marcus continued, his voice rising now, carrying across the chamber. Let me give you a free sample. Humans have this thing called empathy. It's not unique to us, but we've developed it to a pretty sophisticated degree. It means we can model other beings' emotional states. We can feel what they feel, understand their suffering. And it creates this interesting ethical framework where harming vulnerable populations actually causes us psychological distress. We can't just calculate cost-benefit ratios on who's expendable because our brains literally won't let us dismiss suffering that easily. Velshera's form was now displaying patterns that the translation matrix indicated were confusion mixed with irritation. Your emotional reasoning is precisely why your species requires extensive evaluation before council membership. You allow primitive empathic responses to override logical decision-making. This is the mark of a juvenile civilization. Ambassador, Marcus turned to face her directly, and his smile was sharp enough to cut. You think empathy is a weakness. Okay, let's explore that. You know what else empathy does, Arbiter Velshera? It makes us really good at understanding how other beings think and feel. which makes us exceptional at both diplomacy and warfare. Because we can predict how you respond to our actions, we can model your decision trees. We can get inside your heads and ways your species, with your purely logical reasoning divorced from emotional context, probably can't even conceptualize. And right now, I'm using that empathic modeling to read this council chamber, and you know what I'm seeing? He gestured around the room, noting the body language of various delegates, the subtle shifts in posture and position. I'm seeing that at least 40% of this council is deeply uncomfortable with what Arbiter Velshara just proposed. They're trying not to show it because council protocol demands unified presentation, but their species equivalents of micro-expressions are leaking through, which tells me that this standard requirement for primitive species maybe isn't as universally accepted as you implied, which suggests you were testing us, seeing if we'd accept unconscionable terms. And when I politely sat there smiling like I'd been trained to do, you interpreted that as weakness and kept pushing, kept escalating, until you finally pushed far enough to trigger a response. So congratulations, Arbiter, you got your response. Hope it's what you wanted. The council chamber had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is simultaneously trying to process unexpected information and calculate its implications. And Marcus could see various delegates engaging in rapid, subvocal communication with their staffs, reassessing whatever assumptions they'd been operating under. But the real surprise came from an unexpected source: council member Zara, a representative of the Velikari species, 6-foot-tall beings with iridescent scales and multiple sensory organs that humanity's xenobiologists had flagged as potentially empathic themselves, stood from her delegation's seating area and said in a voice that carried clear across the chamber, "Ambassador Chen raises valid concerns that this council should address. The proposal to mandate experimental populations as a membership requirement has never been subjected to full council vote. It has been implemented through arbiter executive authority, citing historical precedent. I move to suspend this requirement pending comprehensive ethical review." The chamber erupted in a chaos of competing voices and translation matrix overload as multiple species tried to speak simultaneously. And Marcus saw Velshara's crystalline form shift through patterns indicating severe agitation. But before she could respond, another delegate stood, then another. And Marcus realized that his outburst had done something humanity's months of careful diplomacy had failed to achieve. It had fractured the council's apparent unanimity, exposed fault lines that had probably been developing for years, given permission for delegates who'd been uncomfortable with council practices to finally voice objections. Zara made her way through the chaos to where Marcus stood surrounded by security drones, and she said quietly, in English, rather than through the translation system, "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've witnessed in 12 years on this council, possibly both. But you should know that some of us have been waiting for someone to finally speak truth to Arbiter Velshara's casual cruelty. Your species' diplomatic approach was too deferential to be effective. But this might actually change things." Marcus looked at her, really looked, seeing past the alien features to the expression that translated across species lines as weary relief. And he said, "I probably just ended Earth's chances at council membership. My government is going to recall me in disgrace. And I'll likely spend the rest of my career teaching diplomatic protocol at some backwater academy as a cautionary example." But I couldn't sit there and smile while she talked about experimenting on 12 million humans like they were lab rats. Some lines you just can't cross. No matter what the strategic calculus says. Zara's scales rippled in what Marcus's cultural briefings had indicated was Velikari laughter. "Your government might surprise you, Ambassador. And as for council membership, you misunderstand what just happened. You didn't end Earth's chances. You established that humanity has limits, has principles. It won't compromise, regardless of incentives or threats. And that is exactly the kind of species the council actually needs. Not more supplicants willing to debase themselves for admission, but partners willing to push back against overreach. Come with me. There are some delegates you should meet. The ones who've been trying to reform council practices from within but lack the political leverage. You just gave us that leverage." She led him through the still chaotic chamber to a smaller side room where several delegates were gathering. And over the next hour, Marcus learned that the Galactic Council was far more fractured than Earth's intelligence services had realized. That Velshara's species, the crystalline hierarchy, had been using bureaucratic procedure and the weight of tradition to maintain power that was increasingly resented by newer council members. That the standard requirements for membership were actually recent innovations designed to assert dominance and extract resources. And that his very public rejection of those terms had given the reform faction an opening they'd been waiting years to exploit. But I still violated about 40 protocols, Marcus said, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with his understanding of the situation. I interrupted council proceedings, left the petitioner's area without authorization, threatened the arbiter. That's not going to just disappear. Zara's scales rippled again. Protocols are tools, ambassador. They serve purposes. And when they stop serving those purposes, they should be changed. You exposed how our protocols have been weaponized to maintain unjust hierarchies. Yes, you'll face consequences. But so will Arbiter Vilshara for proposing terms that violate the Council's own foundational ethics. Ethics we've allowed to erode through precedent and procedure. Your outburst reminded us what we're supposed to stand for. Over the following weeks, as Earth's diplomatic channels exploded with confused and contradictory messages about Marcus's status and the Council's intentions, something unexpected happened. The Reform faction used the incident to force a comprehensive review of Council membership requirements. Velshara's proposal for mandatory population testing was not only rejected, but explicitly banned. And several other exploitative practices were identified and eliminated. Earth's membership petition was fast-tracked, not despite Marcus's outburst, but because of it. Because he demonstrated that humanity would engage in good faith but wouldn't accept abuse, would seek cooperation, but wouldn't compromise core values, would be polite until politeness enabled injustice, and then would very pointedly stop being polite. Marcus expected to be recalled to Earth in disgrace, but instead received a private communication from the Secretary of State that read, "Your methods were unorthodox and violated every protocol we taught you, but your judgment was sound and your timing was perfect." Apparently being authentically human was more effective than trying to be a perfect diplomat. Continue as assigned. And Chen, next time you decide to tell off the entire Galactic Council, maybe give us a heads up first, just a courtesy. The real surprise came during his first formal meeting with the Reform faction. When Zara explained why she'd intervened so quickly during his outburst. "My species has empathic capabilities similar to yours," she said, her scales shifting through colors that indicated serious. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, understanding suddenly that his decision hadn't just been about Earth, it had touched something deeper. Had spoken to other species who'd been ground down by the Council's casual cruelty disguised as standard procedure. "I'm sorry your people went through that," he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "And I'm sorry it took a human throwing a diplomatic tantrum to create space for you to process that trauma." Zara's scales rippled with that laughing pattern again. "Diplomatic tantrum. I'm adding that to my report. But Marcus, you should understand what you actually did in that chamber. You didn't just reject unjust terms, you demonstrated a different model of strength. Strength that includes vulnerability, that admits limitations, that protects the weak rather than exploiting them. And you did it while surrounded by security drones ready to vaporize you, while facing a council that could have crushed Earth's petition immediately, while risking your career and your planet's future. That kind of courage is rare. And it's exactly what the Council needs to see from member species." Their working relationship over the following months evolved into genuine friendship. Zara teaching Marcus the unwritten rules of Council politics while Marcus helped her build coalition support for reform proposals. And somewhere in those late-night strategy sessions and shared frustration with bureaucratic obstruction, Marcus realized he was developing feelings that went beyond professional respect or diplomatic alliance. That Zara's brilliant tactical mind and fierce dedication to justice, and the way her scales shifted colors with her emotions, had become things he looked forward to seeing. That he was, improbably and inconveniently, falling for an alien diplomat who represented a species humanity had barely known existed 6 months ago. He tried to suppress it, told himself it was inappropriate and probably impossible given biological differences and professional complications. But then Zara invited him to a private dinner in her quarters to discuss the upcoming trade agreement vote and spent the entire evening talking about everything except trade agreements, asking about his family and his childhood on Earth and what had made him choose diplomacy after military service. And when he finally worked up the courage to ask why she was so interested in his personal life, She'd looked at him with those multifaceted eyes and said, "Because I want to understand you, Marcus Chen, not just as Earth's ambassador, but as a person. Because somewhere between your speech in the council chamber and our 47th late-night strategy session, I stopped seeing you as a useful political ally and started seeing you as someone I want to know in all the ways beings can know each other. And if that's inappropriate or unwelcome, tell me now and I'll maintain professional boundaries. But if you feel even a fraction of what I'm feeling, then we should probably acknowledge it and figure out what to do about it." Marcus had been trained in diplomatic speech, in careful phrasing and strategic ambiguity. But in that moment he abandoned all of it and said simply, "I feel it too, and I have no idea what to do about it. But I want to figure it out with you." What followed was a relationship that scandalized some delegates and delighted others. That required navigating both species' cultural expectations and biological compatibility concerns. That sometimes felt impossible, but always felt worth the effort. And that fundamentally changed both Marcus's and Zara's understanding of what connection could mean across species lines. They worked together on the Reform Coalition, using their combined influence to push through changes that made the Council more just, more equitable, more aligned with the ethical principles it claimed to uphold. And Earth's membership, when it was finally approved, came with new terms that reflected those reformed principles: mutual cooperation, shared sacrifice, protection of vulnerable populations, and genuine partnership rather than subordination. The day Earth officially joined the Galactic Council, Marcus stood in the same chamber where he'd delivered his diplomatic tantrum months earlier. And this time when he spoke, it was as a recognized member rather than a petitioner. And his speech was brief: Earth accepts this membership with gratitude for the Reform Coalition's efforts to create a council worthy of its ideals. We pledge to be partners who contribute honestly, who engage in good faith, who seek cooperation, and who will speak truth to power when necessary. We will be polite until politeness enables injustice. We will be accommodating until accommodation requires compromising our core values. We will be humble until humility becomes self-abasement. And we hope that this balanced approach will serve both Earth and the Council well. Thank you for giving humanity the chance to participate in galactic civilization, not as supplicants, but as equals." The applause that followed was genuine. And Marcus saw Vilshara still an arbiter, but with significantly reduced authority after the reforms, maintaining a carefully neutral expression that suggested she'd learned something about underestimating species who seemed weak. After the ceremony, Zara found him in one of the Council's observation decks, looking out at the planet below, where representatives from 300 species worked to build something better than what they'd inherited. "You did it," she said, standing close enough that her scales brushed his arm. "You changed the Council." Marcus shook his head. "We did it, and we're not done. There's still so much that needs fixing. So many practices that need reform, so many species that need protection. This is just the beginning." Zara's scales shifted through colors indicating deep affection. "Always so serious, always seeing the next problem to solve. This is one of many things I love about you. But Marcus, sometimes you need to pause and acknowledge victories before moving to the next battle. Today is one of those times. Today you transformed humanity from desperate petitioner to respected partner. Today you proved that strength includes protecting the vulnerable. Today you showed the galaxy what happens when humans stop being polite and start being real. That deserves recognition." Marcus turned to her, seeing her as he always did now, not as an alien delegate, but as Zara, brilliant and fierce and beautiful in all the ways that mattered. "You know what I've learned through all of this," he said, taking her hand carefully, because Velikari had different touch sensitivities than humans, and he was still learning the right pressure and placement. "Humans have been so focused on what makes us different from other species. But what I see when I look around this council is how much we have in common. The Velikari feel empathy like we do. The Korth value family structures. The Zesek hive minds understand sacrifice for the collective good. We're all trying to protect what we love and build something better for those who come after us. The details differ, but the fundamental drive is the same. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that humanity needed to prove we were worthy of joining galactic civilization, but that we needed to recognize we've been part of it all along. We were just late to the conversation." Zara's scales rippled with that pattern Marcus had learned meant deep emotional resonance. You know what the Velikari word for human is, in our language, not the official designation, but the term that's developing in common usage. Marcus shook his head, and Zara smiled, an expression that humans and Velikari apparently shared despite evolving on planets thousands of light years apart. Janalkari, it translates roughly to late arriving kin who speak uncomfortable truths. It's meant affectionately, mostly, it means your family now. Annoying sometimes, challenging often, but family nonetheless, and family protects each other, teaches each other, grows together, so when the next crisis comes, when the next species tries to exploit the weak, or when the next reform faces opposition, or when the next impossible problem presents itself, we'll face it together. Earth and Velkar and the other Reform Coalition species, and anyone else who believes the Council should be better than its worst impulses. Marcus pulled her closer, carefully, always carefully with the biological differences, and said, I like that word. I like being annoying. Family. And Zara, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said weeks ago, but I was worried about the complications and the professional implications and all the very logical reasons why this was a bad idea. Zara's scales shifted to colors indicating curiosity mixed with anticipation. What is it? Marcus took a breath, abandoning diplomatic language one more time, speaking from the heart instead of the head. I love you. I know that's complicated and maybe reckless and definitely going to require some creative problem solving around biological compatibility and cultural expectations, and probably a dozen other issues we haven't even identified yet. But I love you. I love your brilliant tactical mind, and your fierce commitment to justice and the way your scales do that rippling thing when you laugh and how you challenge me to be better, and the fact that you saw me at my absolute worst, throwing a diplomatic tantrum in front of the entire council, and somehow decided I was worth getting to know. So there it is. I love you. And I'm done being polite about hiding it. Zara's scales went through a rapid cascade of colors Marcus had never seen before. And for a terrifying moment, he thought he'd made a catastrophic mistake. But then she was laughing, that full body scale rippling expression of joy. And she said, Marcus Chen, for someone who spent months learning to be diplomatically circumspect, you are spectacularly bad at it when it really matters. And I love you for that. I love you for saying what you mean, for refusing to hide important things behind protocol, for being authentically yourself, even when it's inconvenient or risky. And yes, this is going to be complicated. Yes, we'll have to figure out biological compatibility. Yes, there will be cultural expectations to navigate and probably some scandal and definitely raised eyebrows from multiple species. But I don't care. I love you too, and I'm willing to face those complications if you are. They stood there in the observation deck, human and Velikari, holding each other carefully, looking out at the galactic civilization they were both trying to reform. And Marcus thought about how he'd come to this station 6 months ago, terrified he'd fail Earth, terrified he'd say the wrong thing or violate the wrong protocol or somehow disqualify humanity from the one chance at galactic partnership they might get. And instead he'd done all of those things, violated protocols and said exactly the wrong things by diplomatic standards and absolutely lost his temper in the worst possible setting, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. Had created the opening for reform, had built partnerships that mattered, had led him to this moment with this extraordinary person who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. You know what the strangest part of all this is? Marcus said, still holding Zara, still looking out at the stars. What? She asked, her voice soft. I've spent my entire career trying to be what other people needed me to be. A good Marine, an effective diplomat, a perfect representative of humanity. And none of it worked as well as the moment I stopped trying to be perfect and just started being honest. When I let humanity's polite mode turn off and showed the council who we really are, flaws and all, that's when things actually changed. That's when we made progress. That's when I found you. And I keep thinking about how much time I wasted trying to hide the parts of myself and my species that didn't fit the approved template. When those parts, the emotional parts, the protective parts, the parts that care too much and feel too deeply, when those were actually our greatest strengths all along. Zara turned in his arms to face him fully. You want to know the real reason the Reform Coalition supported Earth's membership so strongly? She asked, and Marcus nodded. It wasn't because you demonstrated humanity's capabilities or resources or strategic value. It was because you demonstrated that humans genuinely care about justice, about protecting the vulnerable, about building systems that serve everyone rather than just the powerful. And you cared enough to risk everything to speak up about it. That kind of genuine ethical commitment is rare, Marcus. And it's exactly what the Council needs more of. So, yes, being authentic instead of perfect was the right choice. Not just for you personally, but for Earth and for all of us trying to build something better here. Years later, when historians would analyze Earth's integration into galactic civilization, they'd mark that council session as the turning point, the moment when humanity stopped trying to fit into existing frameworks and instead insisted on being authentically themselves. And they'd note that this authenticity, far from disqualifying Earth, had instead catalyzed the largest reform movement the Galactic Council had seen in centuries, had created partnerships that reshaped galactic politics, had demonstrated that strength could include vulnerability, that power could include protection of the weak, that civilization could be measured not by technological advancement or territorial expansion, but by how societies treated their most vulnerable members. Marcus and Zara would continue working together, officially as Earth and Velkar's joint representatives on the Reformed Council's Ethics Committee, unofficially as partners in every sense that mattered across species lines, navigating the complications of cross-species relationship with the same determination they brought to political reform, building something unprecedented and beautiful and occasionally extremely frustrating, but always worth the effort. And when younger diplomats from Earth or other species would ask Marcus for advice about galactic politics, he'd tell them the truth, be polite. Yes, respect cultural differences, absolutely. Learn the protocols and understand why they exist. Definitely. But also know when to let the polite mode turn off. Know when to speak truth to power. Know when to risk comfort for conscience. Because the galaxy doesn't need more perfect diplomats following all the rules. It needs authentic people willing to challenge unjust rules, to protect the vulnerable, to build something better than what they inherited. It needs you to be genuinely yourself, because that's when you'll do your most important work. When you stop performing and start connecting. When you stop hiding and start showing up fully. When you stop being what you think the galaxy wants and start being what it actually needs. And if you're lucky, if you're brave, if you're willing to face complications and scandal and the occasional security drone pointing weapons at your head, you might just change things. You might just build partnerships that matter. You might just find love in the most unexpected places. And you might just discover that being human, with all our messy emotions and protective instincts and refusal to sacrifice the vulnerable for convenience, was exactly the right thing to be all along.